Chapters 12 and 13 of Dream of the Red Chamber are both filled with death. In Chapter 12, we have the death of the minor character Jia Rui, who literally pleasures himself to death. I'm not kidding. And in Chapter 13, we have the death of Keqing, another minor character whose demise marks a turning point in the novel. Now, the Chinese adaptation of the death of these characters is pretty cool, sure, but the power of their demise is actually much stronger in the book. And it's stronger in a way that might be hard to grasp when you read the book, especially if you read it in translation into a foreign language. The truth, though, is that the author, Cao Shuiqin, had this amazing method of using minor characters to give depth to his major characters. Actually, Dream of the Red Chamber is filled with minor characters, and they play incredibly important roles in the novel. Their scandals and emotions are so vivid that even the minor characters feel less like flat stereotypes and more like real and well-rounded people. And the way that these minor characters interact with the main characters is simply brilliant. It's the sort of thing that we really need to study. And unfortunately, this is something I can't show you fully. Well, not yet, at least. You see, my translation project of Dream of the Red Chamber is only up to the start of Chapter 13 right now. And so you and I are really going to have to learn some of the secrets of this book together. However, the fun part is that we can take a look to see what other people have said about some of these topics, like the development of minor characters, and see how that compares to what we see in the book. There are a lot of classic literary criticism books out there, but E.M. Forster's Aspects of the Novel is probably a good enough place for us to start. Forster's book was first published in 1927, which means that it's old, but it's still about 170 years younger than Dream of the Red Chamber, which was composed sometime in the 1750s. Now, even though this book is old, Forster's descriptions will be familiar to you, especially if you've tried to write before, stuff like how characters who are always fighting against the author in terms of where the book is going. I swear that I've seen this exact sentiment about characters getting out of hand and ruining the entire book in discussions about writing on places like Reddit and Substack. All of that is to say that Forster kind of knew what he was talking about, even if his writing is a little bit stilted and old-fashioned. However, that doesn't mean that we have to believe everything that he says. Forster decides to divide the characters of novels into flat and round characters. So in the old European tradition, flat characters are what we would call stereotypes today, characters designed around a single idea or ideology, and characters that are easily recognizable without any actual character development. A round character, in contrast, is a character that can surprise the reader in a convincing way. This is a character that breaks the mold, at least according to Forster. While we tend to prefer the flat, stereotypical characters since they reinforce ideas we are already familiar with, it's also natural for us to want to see the rounder, more developed characters. But the interesting thing is that in Dream of the Red Chamber, neither Jia Rui nor Keqing are really what we would call well-rounded or rounded characters, right? They exist, sure, but they're not really given things like, motivation or even really much character description. In fact, as morbid as this might sound, both of these characters really only exist to die. Jia Rui is introduced to the reader in the first schoolroom scene, which is filled with homosexual innuendo, and he's the head of the class since he's the teacher's grandson. And as fate would have it, Jia Rui winds up coming into conflict with a boy named Qin Zhong, who happens to be Keqing's younger brother. Now, the only glimpse we ever get of Jia Rui the person is a brief paragraph explaining that his parents died while he was young and that his strict grandfather, Jia Rui, has raised him under lock and key. The truth, though, is that Jia Rui is only really described in terms of his love for Wang Xifeng, a much more prominent character who is already married and has a child, as it turns out. And it turns out that Jia Rui's endless lust after Wang Xifeng is literally the thing that kills him. Now, think about that for a second. So Jia Rui is actually a flat character in that Forster description, right? And yet he seems to be really lifelike and round to us. The reason why is because he exists really for a specific purpose. That purpose is to show us the ruthless and the cunning side of Wang Xifeng. He's also there to tell us more about the sexual misdeeds of the Jia family, especially the men. Though honestly, we've seen a lot of that already by this point in the novel. Now, the interesting thing about this, though, is that Keqing is actually very similar to Jia Rui. She's also a flat character, but she's also gives you this really well-rounded kind of feel. Qing Keqing exists largely to open up Jia Baoyu to the mystical and sensual side of the world. At the beginning of chapter 5, Jia Baoyu wanders over to Qing Keqing's extremely sensual bedroom, which is filled with seductive scents and provocative items. The stuff described here, the mirror, the platter, the papaya, the couch, and so on, all of these things are direct allusions to sexually charged stories from China's great literary past. In that sense, you can say that Dream of the Red Chamber is undoubtedly a purely Chinese novel, because every single one of these literary allusions refers to something in the Chinese literary past. And this is just a pain in the neck for translators. Believe me, you were looking at my translation there. The hardest part is that doing traditional translations doesn't really give the translators a lot of room to actually explain this stuff. This is why you guys really need to go and check my translation out already if you haven't. Now, the cool thing about writing a living translation in a blog format is that I have all the space in the world to go off on translation tangents that help the story actually make sense. You're not going to get that from the old and dusty versions like this one translated by David Hawkes. Now, at the climax of Jia Baoyu's dream in chapter 5, he ends up being spiritually married to Qing Keqing, which is kind of bizarre since she's actually married to one of his relatives in real life. The two of them wind up having a sexual encounter that might have been in a dream, but is described as being something very, very real. In the end, though, Jia Baoyu's dream ends when he falls into the river of delusion and winds up returning to the mortal world, which I guess means that the world is a world of delusion. Yeah, this stuff is pretty deep, isn't it? But notice here that we haven't seen anything that actually describes Qing Keqing's character. We don't really know much about her. We don't know her likes and dislikes. We don't know how she feels about things. We don't know who she respects and who she hates. We don't even know what the poetry that she writes is like, right? It's sort of like if you go online and you're chatting with a girl or something like that, but you end up just talking about yourself and your fantasies or your thoughts or whatever, right? You don't really know who the other person is. In other words, Qing Keqing is actually a flat character according to Forster's analysis. But the problem is that she seems very, very real. Now, Qing Keqing is one of the so-called 12 beauties of Jinling, which means that chapter 5 includes 2 poems that foretell her fate without actually naming her. In the first one, she is depicted as a beautiful woman hanging herself from a beam. And yes, hanging herself means that she takes her own life. The poem itself muses on the excessive sexuality created by the clash of different emotional types. And emotion here is my translation of Qing, which is the most important character in the entire novel. It's clear that Qing Keqing represents one type of emotion, but it's not clear who represents the second, and it's not immediately clear why she's depicted as hanging herself here when she doesn't do so in the novel itself. Now, the second poem repeats the same themes of the first. The fragrant dust falling from the painted beam is a classical literary reference to a girl hanging herself. And once again, emotion, or Qing, is represented as the root cause of the trouble. Qing Keqing doesn't actually take her own life in the novel. Instead, she winds up dying from some mysterious illness that nobody understands and nobody can cure. But it's clear from the poems that she was supposed to take her own life. And there are a few other references to Qing Keqing being forced into an affair with her father-in-law. An older family servant named Zhao Da screams about the affair between a man and his daughter-in-law in one particularly dramatic scene, even though the affair is never really fully described. In fact, the word that the servant uses in Chinese is actually a euphemism that is pretty obscure unless you're familiar with certain sexually charged classical novels. That would be this word, pa hui, which makes its most prominent appearance in the sexually charged classic novel Jinping Mei. So I guess we could think of this as something like the F word, except that here it's a little bit odd because there are other passages right in the chapters right around this one that depict sexuality in very frank and really blunt terms. For whatever reason, though, this particular heinous act is referred to only through this really obscure phrase. Anyway, the story here is that Qing Keqing is apparently based on a real-life person, as David Hawkes explains, and it seems that Cao Shuiqing deliberately removed direct references to the affair early in the drafting process. In one of the early manuscripts with commentary, there is a mention by one commentator that he had ordered the author to remove passages that referred directly to this affair. David Hawkes' theory is that Cao Shui-Qing removed the incident itself but kept the poetic references intact. The problem with that, however, is that other novels from this time period also had similar inconsistencies. In fact, as the Cambridge History of Chinese Literature describes, there is some reason to believe that Cao Shui-Qing might have deliberately left these contradictions in for literary effect. Anyway, this affair is actually directly depicted in the television version, even though it's not in the book. And this is probably about as steamy a scene as you'll ever see on China's CCTV. Now that's a heck of a lot of attention to pay to a character that's really quite minor. So like Jia Rui, Qing Keqing is never actually fully developed. Forster, again, would have called her a flat character if he had read this book. Of course, we know that he didn't read it because the first English translation of Dream of the Red Chamber doesn't come out until the late 1970s. But Qing Keqing also counts as an unusually minor character, even if you look at what the other literary critics and theorists have said. If you don't like what Forster has to say, you can always turn to James Wood and his book How Fiction Works. Wood's book was published in 2008, so at least we're looking at the same century now, right? Anyway, Wood takes Forster's delineation between round and flat characters on as if it were some kind of personal challenge. Wood tells us that it's stupid to think of characters as possibly being round since they have to be flattened by nature. After all, a book is not actually a window into the soul or some sort of dimensional warp into the mind of a fictional person. Instead, Wood starts talking about characters being either transparent or opaque. But that doesn't really help us understand Dream of the Red Chamber, does it? Not only is it kind of embarrassing to see the literary giants duke it out in ink like this, but it's also really not such a profound point at all. Jia Rui is completely opaque aside for his lust for Wang Xifeng, which is what kills him in the end. Qing Keqing, meanwhile, is even more opaque. Remember, we don't see much of her at all other than the way other characters talk about her. Even the modern commenters and those who make these references to this affair that was apparently taken out of the book don't really give us any hints as to who she actually is or why her death is what sets in motion the fall of the Jia family. Actually, in my opinion, the real answer can be found in David Corbett's The Art of Character, a book that is really intended for writers instead of literary theorists. And in all seriousness, sometimes the best insights in the world of literature come from the people who struggle every day to create it. Corbett tells us quite simply that main characters are only interesting when you see how they interact with secondary characters. So that sounds simple enough and is probably going to strike you as obvious when you really think about it, especially if you think about like your favorite TV show or your favorite movie or whatever. But at the same time, I think at least that this is a genius insight. It also tells us precisely how to understand Jia Rui and Qing Keqing. You see, the fascinating thing about these characters is not really who they are. I mean, because we don't have any information about who they really are. No, the thing that's interesting about them is how they interact with the main characters. In particular, the side of the main characters that come out of that interaction. So what I'm saying here is that Jia Rui really isn't actually a character. He exists only to provoke a certain reaction from Wang Xifeng, one of cold indifference. Similarly, Qing Keqing really only exists to show how the other characters react to her death. She brings out a completely different side of Wang Xifeng, who sees Qing Keqing's ghost in a dream. And the shock and worry causes Jia Baoyu to spit up blood. So let's say you're writing something, right? You're writing like a novel or screenplay or whatever. How do you create unforgettable characters? Well, there's a bunch of stuff you got to do and remember. But if you create minor characters, you can bring out certain sides of your main characters in certain situations. So that's what Cao Shui-Qing's secret is. His secret is that he turns Wang Xifeng, Jia Baoyu, and the other characters into round characters through this skillful use of secondary characters. They become rounded because of the way they react to things like Jia Rui's, advances on Wang Xifeng, or Jia Baoyu going to Qing Keqing's room and having this dream, and so on and so forth. Now you can do the same thing in your writing too, right? This might be a 250-year-old trick, but it still works to this day.